Nobody noticed when I stopped helping. At least, not at first. For years, every Sunday evening, my daughter Emily and her husband Ryan came over for dinner. Sometimes they brought the kids. Sometimes they arrived exhausted from work, but they always came. Friends often told me how lucky I was to have family so involved in my life. I smiled and agreed. What they didn't see was everything happening behind the scenes. 5 years earlier, Ryan's construction business had nearly collapsed after a difficult economic downturn. Bills piled up faster than they could pay them. Emily called me one night, crying so hard I could barely understand her. Without hesitation, I stepped in. At first it was temporary. I covered a few overdue utility bills. Then I helped with rent. A few months later, I paid for repairs on their aging vehicle because Ryan needed transportation for work. The crisis passed, but the assistance didn't stop. Whenever a new problem appeared, I quietly solved it. A broken furnace, school supplies, unexpected medical expenses, a deposit for a new apartment, a loan payment they couldn't quite manage. I never considered it a burden. They were family. Helping them felt natural. But over time, something subtle changed. The thank you calls became less frequent. Then they disappeared altogether. Requests became assumptions. Conversations about finances sounded less like discussions and more like updates. We need to replace the washing machine. The insurance premium increased. The kids need new laptops. The statements weren't direct demands, but they carried an expectation. And almost every time, I found myself reaching for my checkbook. I told myself it didn't matter. I was retired. I had savings. The money wasn't hurting me. Yet deep down, I began feeling less like a father and more like an emergency fund with a pulse. The realization didn't happen all at once. It arrived gradually, hidden inside ordinary moments. One afternoon, I attended my grandson's soccer game. I sat through 2 hours in the cold and cheered louder than anyone. Afterward, parents gathered near the field while children ran around celebrating. Emily was speaking with another mother nearby. I overheard her say, "Thankfully, my dad helps with a lot of things." The woman replied, "That must be nice." Emily laughed. "It definitely makes life easier." Then they changed the subject. That was it. No mention of sacrifice, no mention of gratitude, just a convenience. Life easier. The words shouldn't have bothered me, but they did. For the first time, I wondered whether my support had become invisible. Months later, the moment that changed everything arrived unexpectedly. It happened during my granddaughter's birthday party. The house was crowded with relatives, neighbors, and children racing through hallways. Presents covered an entire corner of the living room. Everyone seemed happy. During dinner, Ryan began talking about vacation plans. He described a beach resort they wanted to visit. The trip sounded expensive. Trying to be helpful, I asked a simple question. "Have you figured out how you'll budget for it?" The table became quiet. Ryan smiled awkwardly. Before he could answer, Emily sighed heavily. "Dad, do you always have to bring up money?" The room froze. I wasn't prepared for that response. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't angry. She simply sounded annoyed, as though I had interrupted something pleasant. I looked around the table. Nobody spoke. Nobody defended me. Nobody said I was only asking a reasonable question. The silence felt louder than any argument. I nodded. "You're right," I said softly. Then I returned to my meal. The conversation resumed. Children laughed. People discussed movies. Someone started telling a joke. But something inside me had shifted. That evening, after everyone left, I sat alone in my living room. The house felt strangely empty. For hours, I replayed the moment in my mind. Not because Emily had embarrassed me, because she genuinely believed I was the one focused on money. The irony was almost unbelievable. For years, I had quietly solved financial problems nobody else wanted to handle. Yet somehow, I had become the person obsessed with finances. Near midnight, I opened a folder in my desk. Inside were records of every recurring expense I still covered. A monthly internet bill, the family cell phone plan, part of the children's private tutoring costs, vehicle insurance, several streaming subscriptions, a small monthly transfer to help with household expenses. I stared at the list. Then I closed the folder. The next morning, I canceled every single one. Not out of anger, not as punishment. I simply decided it was time. If my involvement created resentment, perhaps it should end. Life moved on quietly for 3 days. Then the phone calls began. Emily called first. I didn't answer. Ryan called next. Then came text messages. Finally, on the 4th day, both of them appeared at my front door. They looked worried. We sat at the kitchen table. Ryan spoke first. Did something happen? I knew exactly what he meant. The payments, the canceled accounts, the expenses suddenly landing in their laps. I poured coffee and handed them both a cup. Then I sat down. Emily looked exhausted. We didn't realize how much you were covering. I nodded. For several moments, nobody spoke. Finally, I asked a question. How much did you think I was paying? Neither answered, because they didn't know. And that was the problem. They had never really looked. The support had existed for so long that it blended into everyday life, like electricity, like running water. Always there, never questioned. Emily's eyes filled with tears. I wasn't trying to be disrespectful. I know, I said, and I wasn't trying to control your finances. Ryan stared into his coffee. Then he quietly said something that surprised me. I think we stopped seeing it. That sentence changed everything. Not because it fixed the situation, because it was honest. Nobody was a villain. Nobody had intended harm. We had simply drifted into unhealthy roles. I became the rescuer. They became dependent. Neither side noticed until the arrangement collapsed. The months that followed were difficult. They adjusted their budget, sold one vehicle, canceled unnecessary subscriptions, delayed vacation plans, made sacrifices, real sacrifices. Sometimes they struggled. Sometimes they complained. But they managed. And slowly, something unexpected happened. Our relationship improved. Conversations became lighter. There were fewer discussions about bills and expenses. More discussions about books, movies, school events, and family memories. One evening, nearly a year later, Emily invited me to dinner. As I sat at the table watching my grandchildren argue over dessert, I noticed something different. Nobody needed anything from me. Nobody hinted at financial problems. Nobody expected me to solve anything. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying responsibility for everyone else's choices. I was simply a father, a grandfather, a member of the family. And somehow that felt better than being needed. As dinner ended, Emily walked me to the door. Before I left, she hugged me tightly. "Thank you," she said. The words were simple, but this time, they meant something. Because they weren't attached to a payment, a favor, or a rescue. They were attached to respect. And respect, I finally realized, is worth far more than any check you can write. Some gifts create comfort. Others create dependence. The hardest lesson I ever learned was understanding the difference. The best thing I ever did for my family wasn't helping them. It was eventually stopping.